Hey, how you doing, brother?
Good. How are you?
I'm okay, thanks. So, your name, is it like straightforward Sebastian, or is there like a cool ring to it?
Oh, well, there's no wrong way to pronounce it. So I think it's funny because I hear my name spoken far more often than I ever
Yeah.
say it. So when someone says, "How do you pronounce your name?" I get confused. But it's Sebastien de Castell.
I
But you're
guess
more than welcome
L.
to use the French pronunciation, and Sebastien is fine too.
So, you got French heritage. Is that where we're
I
going here?
do. Yeah, my
Yeah. That's
father. My
cool.
father was born in Paris.
Yeah. So, have you ever lived in Paris, or did you relocate? Holiday.
No, So my parents met in World War II, as it turned out. My father was 59 when I was born, so he was quite old. And they had moved to Quebec on the east coast of Canada. And then, so my first spoken language was English, but my first written language was actually French because I went to French school for primary school.
Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah,
when I
yeah.
was 15, we moved out to, my mother and I moved out to British Columbia. This was after my father had passed away. And yeah, so I've lived on both coasts of the second largest country on the planet.
Nice. It's quite cool to have such a, heritage. And I mean, we're dating back to like World War II, within this conversation. So that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes me like think, okay, now I understand why you're a fantasy author. I guess, there's a lot coming from there as well. Maybe,
It's
maybe not.
No, it's I think it's true. I think so. One of the things about me is my father passed away when I was quite young. He died when I was 9, and he was quite ill for most of my life. So he had some heart attacks. He died from died of lung cancer when I was 9, which meant, of course, he was ill for many years before that. And so for me, in many ways, he was a figure of the stories that I was being told by my mother, by my brothers and sister. And so I think there is an element of when you mostly know someone who it was so integral to your life through stories about them, it's natural to kind of bring some of that into your fiction writing, I think. And I mean, I've never written a character that was explicitly meant to represent my father, but some of the values that he espoused, he was a very old school kind of gentleman, who'd fought in war. He'd been a spy in World War II. And so, principles of honor and dignity and doing what's right were quite present in the stories about him, whether they were entirely true or not. Because every
Yeah,
family has their mythology, don't they? Right? And sometimes it's very far back. Sometimes it's like your great great grandmother was this or did this. In my case, it was just literally at the level of my father, my mother. Because they were both quite old when I was born. They the for me the family mythology was all about them.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I took a shot in the dark there, but at least I know I was going on the right avenue. I always love to put the puzzle when it comes to any creator. Why do they do what they do? Then we like, dig deeper, take this quantum leap downwards, then, okay, now I get it. I understand why. Sebastian, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for taking the time, for being here. So you got
My
your book that's coming out on the 22nd. That's correct.
Yeah, on the 22nd of May, Malevolent 8 is coming out.
Yeah, yeah. So before we jump into, your book, and then you can briefly give a description about the book and what, readers, listeners can expect. Let's
Mhm.
get to like, know you like, a bit better, build that intimate relationship, with the listeners. Like I got a list here, man. when I was reading your bio, I got a list. You have carried so many hats. I'm even gonna like read this list. So you got a degree in archaeology. Okay, you've been
Mhm.
a teacher, musician, fight choreographer, designer, project manager, project strategist. Wow. And then you go on to say that, this played a role in your writing, currently. in modern times. So where did it all start for you, and why the so many leaps into different, careers? Just some like background
Sure.
history.
Well, interestingly, I mean, for me, it really did begin in a way with books, not with me thinking of writing, but just how influential they were for me. So when I was 15 or 16 years old, I was off camping by myself on an island off the coast of British Columbia, and I ended up at a ferry terminal about 6 hours too early for the ferry. So I had nothing to do but sit there. Of course, ferry terminals on islands off the coast of British Columbia are quite beautiful. You're looking out over the rocks in the ocean. But I found a book on one of those, spinner shelves they used to have in stores, where there'd be like a rack that would turn around and you could find books. I found a book called Bard by Keith Taylor, who's an Australian author. And he's still around. He's a wonderful author and a lovely person. Anyway, I read this book, and I just read it all while I was sitting there. It was a story about this character who was a bard, an 8th century Irish bard, who spent his life traveling and playing music and writing and telling stories and getting into sword fights. And I just had such a profound feeling in that moment of, that's it. That's the life I want. I want to be a bard. But of course, Bard is not a job that shows up in the help wanted ads very often. And so for me, in a way, a lot of my career over the subsequent decades became finding ways to experience pieces of that. So, for example, I was a traveling musician for several years. I made my living playing small towns all over, wherever they wanted our band to play. I started fencing quite late in life relative to most people, but I ended up choreographing a play, a production of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, the sort of famous, sort of dark, somewhat comedy, somewhat tragedy play. And that led me to choreographing sword fights for other theater productions for a couple of years. And so as I went through all these different jobs and experiences, which for me were all a form of kind of, traveling through the culture that I live in a way, right? Like experiencing different facets of this kind of big and wondrous culture by doing different jobs. And as a result, by the time I was, getting my first novel was being published, I had traveled a lot of the world. I had played music. I had sung songs. I had done sword fights. I had lived some of that bardic existence. And so it really culminated then in about 2014 when Traitor's Blade, which was my first novel, was published. And it was a swashbuckling fantasy novel. And that kind of launched my career. And now, about a decade later, my 18th novel is being published.
Wow. It's so crazy, so many people, even myself at times growing up, you read this book and there's this character that you attracted by, and you want to be that character. But fear actually jumps in for us to actually take the leap, where you have said, okay, no, I'm jumping in. This is what I want to do. And you just went for it. Did you have like any doubts about it, pursuing that sort of life? And how did you overcome it?
It's
Or if
funny.
there was
I think in some ways, I don't know why, but I was born with a particular superpower, which is that I don't mind being bad at things. I have no problem if something interests me. I have no problem trying to do it, even though I know I will never be able to compete with other people who are much better at it. So, for example, I didn't really start playing guitar until I was 19 or 20 years old. Which is way too late. I tried multiple times before to learn guitar because my older brother is a fabulous guitar player, and I always wanted to be like him because he was incredibly cool. But I only really started trying to take it seriously when I was about 19 or 20. But within 3 months I was in a band and I was playing gigs in small towns where we only knew, 6 songs and had to play them, multiple times over the course of the night. And that was okay with me because I don't mind the experience and realizing I'm not as good as other people at something. What I appreciate, what I enjoy is the adventure of doing it. And so that's very much what it was like. Even writing, I often say when I was about 10 years old, my brother and I, who's 4 years older than me, our mother brought us together in the living room for an important chat, and she said, our father had passed away the year before. Your father's pension's not really enough money for us to live on very well, so I'm going to have to find a way to make money, and I think the easiest way is to be a novelist. And she said, because anyone can write a novel. And so she was going to write romance novels. And this is a woman who was, had been in World War II in the British Home Guard, who thought that above all else, romance should be sensible. So if you can imagine anything less appealing to romance readers than a romance novel in which all of the romance has to be sensible, that's what she wrote. And of course, no publisher picked it up. But what that really instilled in me is a sense of, of course you can do it. If you want to write a novel, of course you can write a novel. You want to run a marathon, of course you can run a marathon. You just have to put in the work. So I think it's not as if I've lived my life, as a constant series of perils, where I was on the verge of everything falling apart. I've made lots of decisions, like as so many of us do, that were safe, secure decisions. It's just that for me, once a certain level of security is found, I will just then tend to go, okay, now it's time to do something else. That's what happened with writing. I was in an absolutely fabulous job working for a company that treated me so well, and I loved everyone there. It was Vancouver Film School here in Vancouver, and it's an entertainment school. It's been around for over 35 years, I think. And I loved working with the students and the teachers, and I had this amazing job. I was paid incredibly well. They would let me take time off when I wanted to take time off, or arrange my schedule the way I wanted. It was a perfect job. But I hit a point where I was like, well, I've been here for 10 years, and if I'm going to try something different, I need to try it now. And so I left that behind with really no real guarantees, and managed to get a 4-book deal on my debut novel, and then an 8-book deal, and then another 4-book deal, and then a 2-book deal. It just sort of happened from there. So I've been tremendously lucky. But to your point, I haven't always just taken all the risks. I think sometimes people who want to write a novel for the first time become intimidated, and they become intimidated because they either think, well, I didn't start soon enough, everyone's going to be better than me, or what if it doesn't work? And I just think none of that matters. You write a novel, you sit down and write the novel, you discover what you're going to write. One of the first things you said, before, when you said you like to put the puzzle together and find out why creative people do what they do. One of the trade secrets from the standpoint of novelists that I'll reveal to you now, we almost never know why we're writing a particular book. When I wrote Malevolent 7, I thought I was writing a book. My intention was, I'm just going to write something. It's going to be just for me. It's going to be whatever the hell I want to write, because I'd come off of, my 10th book had been published. I'd come off of a 6-book series in which, because it was young adult fantasy, and the language around young adult fantasy gets more and more policed as time goes by. And I thought, I need to just write whatever I want, no matter how atrocious it is, no matter how offensive it might be to someone. And it's just for me, and I won't publish it. And I wrote this book called Malevolent 7, which I wasn't going to sell. And then my agent had kind of heard about it and said she wanted to read it. And then I said, okay, but no one's going to like this. And she said, oh, I love this. Let's sell it. And I said, no. And then she was retiring, and my new agent said, I've heard about this manuscript, Malevolent 7. Can I read it? And I said, sure, but no one's going to want this. And then he read it, and he was like, no, I really want to sell this. And I said, you can try, but nobody's going to want to buy it. And it was the fastest sale I ever made on a manuscript. And it was only later that I realized, when I was reading the book in public, when I, as an author, sometimes you do these, author events and you'll read from your book, that I realized that what I was really writing about was, you mentioned, or people will often mention that the characters are in Malevolent 7 are anti-heroes. It's a group of mercenary war mages who basically see themselves as the bad guys. And but they run into this situation where they realize the world is in danger, and the heroes aren't going to do anything about it. Either aren't able, don't know, or don't think it's a problem. And so they end up having to do that. And it made me, and I realized that what was really driving me to write that book was my fear about our present time, in which we divide everyone up into either good guys or bad guys. And the good guy, a bad guy is anyone who's ever done anything bad, and a good guy is someone who's never done anything bad. You don't even have to do something good to be a good guy. You just have to never do anything that anybody disapproves of. But the problem is we can't survive without all of each other. We need bad guys to do good things sometimes, right? We need people who have proven themselves in multiple ways to be terrible, to sometimes do the right thing. Otherwise, society falls apart. And that's really what Malevolent 7 and Malevolent 8 are about. So I apologize. That was a very long answer to your question, but that's how it all fits together for me.
No. I mean, this is what it's about, is getting to know, the full extent of the background of what led you to actually, write these sort of books. When you were talking about, you did one thing and then you reach a certain period and you move on to the next thing. I find it to be common, with creators, like we get bored easily, right? When something is not challenging anymore, then what's the point of even doing it? Because then it's just like, this rat race over and over each and every single day. So I get where you're coming, with that. You reach a certain point, as you said, working for a company. I can also share that also happened in my own personal life, once upon a time. And then you're like, okay, no, I've already done whatever I needed to do here. What more is there? There's no more challenges. I'm doing the same thing day after day. You need to move on because you're just getting bored and you're not really living anymore. You're dying inside. Yes.
Yeah.
Extremely common.
Yeah, and I think it's even harder now, I think, especially for creators who are online, because the feedback is so constant that, I see people who sort of come to realize quite early on, well, if I, let's say with, podcasts or videos, if I put something up like this type of post or this type of vlog or this type of podcast episode, then I know I'm going to get more listeners, more likes, more whatever it is. And we're constantly inundated about this data about what we create that, I see for a lot of people, it becomes very difficult because instead of being able to follow their instinct, their creative instinct, I think I want to go in this direction now. They're often held back by this sense of, okay, but you have this thing, that works, and these other things don't seem like enough people like them. And in some ways, it's a little easier for a novelist because there's a less ephemeral sense of what you're making, because our emphasis, especially in the world of social media and content creation, is so time bound. It's so much, what's happening today. That pressure is very high. Whereas with a novel, your part of you is always thinking about 20 years from now, like not who's going to read this tomorrow, who's going to read it 20 years from now. So, for example, I have a book, I think one of the best books I've ever written is a book called Way of the Argosy, which is part of this Argosy trilogy. And it's one of my least popular books. But it doesn't matter because I know that, if the Spellslinger TV show, because this other series is part of this broader fantasy series called Spellslinger, and that's been optioned for film and television, and that's in development now. It may never happen, but if it does happen, even 5 years from now, if that series goes on the air, then Way of the Argosy will get a second chance in the world for people to find it, and so it's a little easier that way. But yeah, it's tricky to. I think it always takes a lot of courage for creators to go in different directions than what everyone is telling them to do.
Yeah. Exactly. If you had to and I know this is a long time ago, okay, when your mother first decided, okay, I'm going to start, writing a novel, I'm going to be a novelist. And then your first novel that you ever, wrote, and then you compare it to what it takes, especially from a marketing point of view, like in 2025, has it become easier? Would you say, back then was easier, to get your novel out there? Okay, it's still easier to get a novel out, where there's less red tape in 2025. But becoming a successful novelist, back then versus present, has it affected you in any way?
It's always hard to say especially because luck plays such a factor in these things. I mean, so does writing a really good book. I mean, you have to work really hard to write the best book you can. You always want to write what I call the best version of the story that you want to tell. but beyond that, luck plays into it. What I would say is, I think 40 years ago, for example, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago, if you were within a certain group where that everyone associated as authors, so people writing in English, where English is their first language, where they look a certain way, they come from a certain social class, because the people that decided whose books got published tended to be people that looked like me, and so there was a certain bias there that made it easier. You came in, when we talk about privilege and things like that, that's where privilege plays in, is when the people who decide whether someone gets a particular job or gets their book published, when you are the person that they think of, and you are writing the books that are what they think of. That's changed over the last 15 years for two, I think, big reasons. One is, I think globally we're a little bit more conscious that approach limits the kinds of stories that we get to see, and eventually people get tired of stories that are all from the same group of people and all sound, they're all basically similar stories, no matter how well you try to write them. And the second is the rise of self-publishing, because self-publishing means that if you have a good story, you can publish it no matter what any particular publisher or gatekeeper thinks about it. And so I have friends, I have lots of friends who are fully self-published, and they make a great living as novelists. And they wouldn't take what we call a traditional deal from a publisher, even if it was offered to them. I have other friends who started self-published because they thought, I think Evan Winters talked about this. He wrote Rage of Dragons, which is a fantastic fantasy novel, an epic fantasy series. And when he first published, he self-published because he thought a traditional publisher probably wouldn't want it. But then traditional publishers saw how good it was, and they approached him. Like, they literally contacted him out of the blue and said, "We want to republish your books. We want to give you a big book deal." And so now, he's traditionally published. So those two forces, I think, a greater awareness that we want, that the public, the reading public, wants access to more stories from more people, and the fact that there's now self-publishing, so that if you're willing to put in the work and put in the marketing work and all that stuff, you can be successful without any gatekeepers in that space. I think that has made it easier for a broader group of people to be part of the world of fiction.
Yeah. But then again, there's, as you said, you'll have to put in the work. You're going to have to put in the work yourself. That's, the route you actually want to take. So where do you fit in? Are you self-published, or do you fall under a traditional publishing deal?
I'm entirely traditionally published. I was really fortunate early on in my career, thanks to my wife, who's a librarian, who was at a conference and met a fellow named Mike Bryan, who was heading up Penguin in Canada back then. Mike's wife, Heather, had started up a literary agency. And so Christina met them while I was in the hotel room at the time, writing query letters for agents, and talked about the book. And Mike liked the idea. He mentioned it to Heather, who then asked for the manuscript. I sent it, and 3 weeks later contacted me and said she loved the book, wanted to represent me. And then I got just very lucky from there. I remember at the time saying, well, I'd like a 4-book deal in 3 months. And she said, well, that's pretty unrealistic, given that you've never been published before. And I said, look, it's fine. It doesn't have to be a lot. I just want 6 figures for 4 books. And she, didn't take that very seriously. And then almost 3 months to the day, my wife and I were on a cycling trip. And I got an email, and it was from Heather, and she was kind of shocked. And she said, well, it turns out we've got an offer for a 4-book deal for exactly 6 figures, which wasn't a ton when you spread it over 4 books, but it was still amazing. Yeah. And that launched my career. So yeah, I'm entirely traditionally published. The only things I self-publish are short stories, because it's just easier that way, and I don't like spending forever submitting stories to magazines. And my first short story collection, which is called Tales of the Greatcoats, Volume 1, which is short stories associated with the world of my first book series, I'm continuously amazed by how well that sells. Every day I just get a little notification that it sold a few more copies here and there. So yeah, but other than that, I've always worked with publishers. I love that part of it. Not everybody does. Not everyone has a good experience working with publishers. I've had challenging experiences working with publishers. I'm sure all my publishers would say that sometimes I'm challenging to work with. But overall, I really do enjoy the process of a team of people that you get to work with, who all have different areas of expertise, who are saying, no, here's what we think we should do in terms of the cover. Here's where we think you should go on a book tour and things like that. So I love it.
And with creative control being traditionally published for so long, does it still start and end with you? I know you get several various opinions from that team, but do you have the final say, with your work? I think that's what most, creators are really, scared for, to go down that, road with the publisher.
It's one of those things where different authors will have different experiences of this. I have never, certainly with the content of my books, with the text, the manuscript, I have never felt as if someone was threatening to take away any kind of control. I mean, first of all, they really can't, because you always have the option of saying no. They have the option of saying, well, therefore, we're deeming the manuscript unpublishable and we won't publish it. But that's extremely rare that happens. It does happen, but it's quite rare. For me, it's never been that way. But then I always look at things through a particular lens that I think is helpful for any writers in your audience, which is when someone comes and tells you about a manuscript, your manuscript, and they say, there's a problem with your manuscript, and here's what you should do to fix it. They're almost always right about the problem and almost always wrong about the solution. So they will sort of tell you, well, here's this element or this character or this plot beat, and it's not working very well. And then they'll suggest, and here's what you should do. Just change this, cut this, do this. Because for them, they're looking for what they see as the most likely, quickest solution to that problem. But as a writer, that will almost always be the wrong answer for me. So for example, I had an excellent editor on the first Spellslinger novel. And at the end of that book, or late in that book, there's a moment between Kellen, who's the main character of that story. He's a 16-year-old young man who lives in a very magical society, who's discovered that he has no magic of his own and has to find a new path for himself in life. And there's a moment between him and the female character that he has kind of, always had a crush on, basically. And my editor said, I think you should cut out the kiss. And I thought that was interesting. And I said, why? And she said, well, because it's going to make readers think that this other character, Nefenia, is going to show up in other books. And she's not. And I said, well, how do you know she's not going to show up in other books? There's 5 more books and I haven't written them yet. And she said, well, because she's not a very good character. And said, so if you just cut the kiss, everything's fine. And I thought about that, and I understood what she was saying, but I realized, no. She's right about the problem, that Nefenia is not a great character right now, not a complete character, but she's wrong about the solution. And so I went back and I rewrote several scenes with Nefenia, and I wrote a couple of extra scenes for her, so that she became a character with agency, with meaning, with her own importance. And then, and so that when the point of that kiss happening late in the book, the reader had a very different sense of who she was. And then I submitted the manuscript. And I remember when I was working on book 2, my publishers said, is Nefenia going to be in this book? Because, everybody wants to see more of her. And I was like, no, because you said they wouldn't like her, so you can't have her for book 2. But she appears in all the other books. So, which is how I dealt with that. But you see what I mean? That it's, no one's ever really trying to take control away from you. They have a vision for they have an idea of what they think really works in a book. And they will sometimes say, here's what's wrong with your book and here's how to fix it. And again, if you listen and take to heart the things that they're identifying as not working, but then ask yourself, what is my solution as the writer? Because I know those characters better than anyone can. Then you'll have a better chance of fixing it. Because the problem with almost every manuscript, when it has a problem, is that what's on the page is not actually what's in the writer's head. You know, we have a story in our heads. I mean, everybody who's tried to write a story has this experience. You have this amazing story in your head. It's full of conflict and these rich characters, and you write it down. And then when you read back what you've written, you're like, well, that's not what I wanted to say. That's not.
Yeah.
I haven't found a way to translate my thoughts and my feelings into narrative text. And so, if you just remember that, whatever someone's criticism of a story or a manuscript, what they're really criticizing is the text, because the story only really exists in you as you're creating it, and in them as they're creating it for themselves based on the text. That text is like a wall. It's a wall between the writer and the reader. And if you don't paint that wall perfectly, then the reader's not going to see what you're seeing. So that's usually how I approach it. But I've had fights with publishers over book covers. Occasionally I'm right, often I'm wrong, which is a way better outcome, because, you know, if I prefer it to turn out that someone else was right and that it worked out better than I expected. That was true of Malevolent 7, by the way. You know, I fought with my publisher over the cover because I thought, this isn't right. You know, here's why I don't agree with you. But they guns, and then it ended up being a cover that people just, the book was a big success. People just pick it up and they see the cover and they grab it. And so when it was time for Malevolent 8, they said, do you want to participate in briefing the cover? Do you have any, do you want to, how do you want to go with the cover? I said, just, you guys figure it out, because you had a better instinct for it than I did. But other covers, you know, there's some of my covers that I've literally been the art director for myself. So, for example, Play of Shadows, that cover, I'm the one that commissioned it, because I wanted to make, I had a vision for it. And then I showed it to my publishers and said, here's the cover. Your choice is, you can either take this cover and use it, or you can make a better cover, or you can refuse to make a better cover and refuse to use this one. But then I'm going to change the title on it, and I'll publish my own book with this cover, and we'll see who wins. But they just said, yeah, no, we love it. And they went with it right away.
You know, I guess, you know, to conclude on that, you know, my feels about it is, you know, because the independent space or self-publishing space, you know, whether it be, you know, on the writer side of, you know, being a creative, or whether you be an independent musician, you know, because there's so much less red tape and so much more opportunities available, you know, for you, publishers or record labels are adapting to this change in order for them to still keep a good percentage of market cap. We can't operate how we were operating 20 years ago. For example, in the music business, offer a 360 record label deal and think, okay, no, that the creative is just going to allow us to have full control of the masters or full control of the creative work, and I'm only going to get 60% royalties of my final product, you know, whether it be a track or whether it be a book. You know, you're not going to get that anymore. So in order for us to still maintain a good presence globally in the space, we need to adapt. So we need to meet the creative halfway now. So I'm sure behind the scenes, you know, they're chatting with each other, having their fancy board meeting and saying, okay, you know, here's Sebastian, we're going to offer him a four book deal, you know, the 6-figure deal over this time period. But guys, we need to be lenient in certain areas, you know, if we're going to also, you know, have him in the long run, have his respect and work with him. Because, you know, we're more conscious now about these things. You know, education is free now. Now we can go online and be like, okay, you know, this is what I should look out for when it comes to this type of deal. I mean, back then, let's just say the 90s, you know, that information wasn't so easily available to a creative. Now it is. So I'm sure they say, okay, let's get, you know, we need to change how we're operating, change the whole model, you know, be a traditional publisher, but still act in a very independent manner.
I see some of that. Oh, no, you're, yeah. I mean, and some of that certainly is out there. And there's now what we sometimes call hybrid publishers, which are publishers that will offer most of the publishing services, but they may not offer as large an advance or offer any advance to a writer. Because the challenge of self-publishing, of course, is that you're no longer just the writer. You're the publicist, you're the marketer, you're the publisher, you're the typesetter, you're the art director, you're in charge of everything. And some people embrace that. I have a good friend of mine, Andy Peliquin, who's a great art director because he art directs his covers. He's a great typesetter because he knows exactly how to do that. He's a great production manager because he knows how to put out a Kickstarter and create bound volumes. Another friend of mine, Ben Galley, puts out these gorgeous special edition hardbacks that I would have no idea how to produce. And so if you're comfortable doing all of that, then it's terrific. For other people, they want more of a sense of a team behind them. And so sometimes hybrid publishing works that way. But you're right, even in traditional publishing, because more and more there's an expectation that the writer is going to be helping with the publicity and the marketing. So for example, with Malevolent 8, that's coming out on May 22nd, my newsletter, so my email list, the people that like to hear from me regularly, they're the most important people for the launch of one of my books now, because if they all pre-order it, the book's going to be a hit, because bookstores decide how much to restock of a book based on pre-orders. So if they're getting no pre-orders, they pretty much decide the book's going to die within a week. If they're seeing a lot of pre-orders, they will then say, oh, this book's really important, we better make sure we have enough stock of it. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So because of that, because my publishers they're doing marketing and publicity, of course, as well, but they need me to do some as well, then it's a more collaborative process. We have to listen to each other, we have to integrate with each other.
Yeah, you still have to work together, because you've already built, your community and your fan base, your social media platforms, if you are on social media, so you build your community there, with that audience each day or every second day. So of course, you have to work together to reach the same goal. They both want to reach. So with Malevolent 8, what can, readers expect now? So we're talking about let me catch up there. So far we got 1 to 7.
No, it starts with 7. It's so funny when I warned my publishers when Malevolent 7 was coming out. So the Malevolent 7 was originally a standalone. I already had plans for sequels, but it was published first on its own, and then it became a success. My publisher said, "Okay, well, we want to do 2 sequels." And I said, okay, I think we should change the series name to Malevolent 7. And then the next book could be called something like that. I wanted to call it, there's a famous Western called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I wanted to call it The Bad, the Worse, and the Wicked. And they said, no, let's call it Malevolent 8. And I said, people are going to think that there's a book 1 to 6, no, no one will think that. And I was like, no, people do. So it's a fair assumption. So Malevolent 8 really picks up after the end of Malevolent 7. It's about Malevolent 8 is about a sort of a supernatural war where these 2 sort of great powers that see themselves as gods have finally found a way. They've been trying to basically have a crusade against one another for millennia. And they can't because they occupy different realms of existence from one another. And so humanity has always been the intermediary by which they sort of fight each other, basically fighting for, as we sometimes say, fighting for souls. They want more humans to worship them than the other guys. But at the end of, in Malevolent 8, they have found a way to finally have a war against each other, but it's on the mortal realm. And this sort of comes out of a lot of the people who suffer the most in war aren't the nations that are actually at war with one another. It's the nations who are in between, because all of a sudden other people are using your country, your land as a battlefield. And so the Malevolent 7, led by Cade Ombra, who's it's called a former Glorian Justiciar, which was a kind of a holy inquisitor magistrate for one of the sides in this, who left them when he realized that they weren't nearly as nice as they pretended to be. He's determined to prevent this war at all costs. His approach to peace is we're gonna have peace no matter how many people we have to kill. And so he's trying to, he and the Malevolent 7, these kind of emotionally damaged war mages, are all trying to find ways to make war untenable, to make it unprofitable. But along the way, they encounter a woman from another plane of reality who's very dangerous, who's working for an unknown third party, who's much more powerful than they are, and warns Kate at the beginning of the book that she's going to have to kill him before this is done. In the old, I always love that theme in certain old westerns of the hero who encounters the gunslinger who's better than them, who doesn't want to kill them, but says someone's going to, my bosses are going to tell me to kill you before this is done. And watching that hero have to go through the story, knowing that this is coming, knowing that they can't beat them, is always appealing to me. And so that's what I wanted Cade to experience. And if that's not enough to draw your listeners into wanting to read the book, there is a dragon vampire kangaroo in the novel. So
Okay.
that sells itself.
That's something new.
I know. When my publishers asked for sequels, my agent said, "Okay, well, you have to write a pitch." So often, when you're a novelist, either you sell a book on with a manuscript, so you on spec, you write the whole book, and then you hope someone will buy it, or you write on a pitch where someone says, well, just give us sample chapters and a synopsis and an outline, and then we'll decide if we want to buy it. And so that's what they wanted for this. And I said, well, why do I have to write a pitch? They only want sequels because the first book was successful. So it's going to be sequels to that book. And my agent said, well, you have to do this. That's part of the process. And he said, but you can take as many weeks as you want. And I said, no, forget it. I got off the phone with him and I just sat down and I wrote the pitch right then and there. And I was describing this horrific scene of just all this grotesque magical violence happening because I was in a bit of a mood, and I was just making jokes about in the pitch. I was making jokes about my publishers wanting a pitch, and then I realized, oh no, there needs to be 7 of them in whatever this opening scene is going to be, and there's only 6 by the end of the previous book. So I just went, and then the 7th member is. And I just went, Temper, a 7-foot vampire kangaroo that no one knows where he came from, that bludgeons his enemies to death with his boxing technique and then drinks their blood. And it was just this grotesque, horrific sort of description of this creature that I thought was hilarious. And it was mostly a joke. I sent it to my agent as a kind of a joke because I put together the pitch, and then my letter to my agent was very formal. It was, Dear John, attached you will find the proposed pitch for Malevolent 8.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll agree this in form and style conforms to the highest standards of literary fiction and blah, blah, blah. Yours truly. And my agent, because he's got I love him. And like me, he has the emotional temerity of a 15-year-old boy, went, oh, this is great. And just sent it to my publishers without any editing. Without coming back and saying it's ridiculous. You're literally mocking your publishers or for expecting a synopsis inside the pitch. And 3 days later, we just got this reply from my publishers, and it was like a 1-sentence reply, and it just said, "You had me at vampire kangaroo." And
wow.
that was the acquisitions process. So. Yeah, that's the thing I love about my publishers for this, especially for this book, is they have a very good sense of humor, which makes it much easier to get through the more difficult negotiations.
It's like, as you said there, I mean, you're thinking as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
you're still thinking as a kid, what would a kid feel? What sort of emotions are going on? And imagination is just going wild.
Mm-hmm.
How many creators, they have this wild idea, daydreaming about it. They'll put it down on paper, but they'll never submit it. Whereas you just submit and boom, it's the next creator's idea. It's something fresh, it's unique, it's never been heard of, and we got an opportunity now to showcase it to the world.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. The worst thing I think any of your listeners who want to be novelists, the worst thing they can do is to self-censor the ideas that make them excited. Malevolent 8 isn't. It's not meant for teenagers at all. It's very much a book for adult readers. But the fact is, a lot of people feel, I think, very restrained. They feel, there's always people saying, oh, you can't say this now, or you can't make this joke, or things like that. And I think we misinterpret the intention of the attempts of our society to become more more conscious of the effects of our words, which is you have to not set out to hurt other people. You have to be aware that some of the things you might say are right, some of the jokes you might want to tell, some of the songs you might want to sing can actually have a direct impact on people. And as long as you're aware of that, as long as you're conscious of that and not doing that, as long as you're, Malevolent 8 is a very irreverent novel, as was Malevolent 7. There's humor in there that you would not tell your kids, but none of it's hurtful, and that's key, right? So for your listeners who want to be novelists, if they have an idea that they love, that gets them excited, their job is to write the most potent version of that story, not to censor it. I always use the example of Twilight. So the Twilight books by Stephanie Meyers, and they became the series of films. And then lots of people would criticize those films and those books, and they would say, "Oh, this is so tired," and "Oh, sparkly vampires, it's just stupid." The very sort of elite way of looking at it. And I don't have to personally appreciate those books to recognize that lots of people find something relevant in there. And the worst mistake you can make as a writer is if what you love is sparkly, handsome, kindly vampires, is to go, "Oh, well, I don't want people to think I'm uncool, so I better tamp it down. I better make them not so sparkly. I better make them not so handsome. I better make them not so in love." And what you end up with when you do that is just absolute enforced mediocrity and self-censorship. And it doesn't work. That's the problem. Nobody ends up enjoying that. Whereas if you write the most sparkly vampires imaginable, they're the most in love, they're the most beautiful and handsome, then as long as that's what you're genuinely driven to, you'll find lots of other people who feel the same way. And so I'm not particularly drawn to sparkly vampires, but I am drawn to like weird kind of moderately obscene monsters that become heroes. And so I just went all in on Vampire Kangaroo as a creature. And he literally only says one word in the entire book. He says it 17 times. It's the only word that he knows, and it's a completely terrible word. But it gets funnier as the book goes on. So that is one of the risks and responsibilities, I think, of being an artist in whatever space you're in, whether it's painting or music or fiction. You have to take the idea as far as it will go. That's what society, when people buy your music or buy your book or buy your art, that's what they're paying you to do. That's your job. Go out. Okay, you have this idea. Go out into the world, the culture, your own psychology, your own experiences, wherever you have to go, and find the most potent version of that idea and give us that. And I think that will always tend to work. It's much easier. The first time I was doing acting, any kind of stage and film acting, I remember a friend of mine said, kept saying, "Go bigger, go bigger." And I was like, "Well, that looks stupid." And he said, "No, but if you go too big, we can rein you in. But if you're too small, we can't do anything with that." And I think that's guided me a little bit in my fiction as well.
You're a creator, go out and create.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't have to be fearless in every part of your life, but you have to allow yourself. Yeah. Remember that when you're writing a novel, you're often by yourself in a room. If you can't be fearless in that room by yourself, then you're really going to struggle. And so you have to give yourself permission to be fearless in that moment. You don't have to send out the manuscript that goes too far. You can show it to people you trust. You can pull it back when you need to pull it back. But when you're first sitting down to write, if you are already as you're trying to write your story, if you're already censoring yourself or holding yourself back, then you make a wonderful, difficult task almost impossible and unpleasant. So just let yourself go crazy.
Self-sabotage, that's what most creators these days, living in this digital area, being overwhelmed and confused about AI and the future of, creators with that. When you were talking about the Twilight series, I can also reference J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. I mean, she was rejected several times before that actually started to take off. But I mean, once upon a time, someone thought it was a crazy idea. And I mean, it became a franchise that I even love.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You can love the Harry Potter books without loving J.K. Rowling, which is how it's supposed to be.
Yeah,
Books are pieces of art; they're separate from the artist. You know, and so yeah, you know, when I was a musician, I remember sometimes I would just go down into the basement of the place I rented with three other people, and and turn on the guitar, and I would just play the most lunatic things, like just with no craft, no sensibility, no style, just because sometimes you know you have to do that to find something musical that's interesting to say, right? The thing I love most about being a novelist, and I think it's true for songwriters as well, is you can screw up 99% of the time, because the 1% when you make something great, that's the only part anyone's ever going to see. You don't have to show people every bad thing, every mistake you make in a song, every bad idea that started and stopped too early. You're digging for gold. You know, prospectors, you know, when they used to dig for gold, they didn't show up in town with
yeah,
16 buckets of stone, of rocks. They came into town with the gold that they found, and that's kind of what we do. So giving yourself permission to do that, to, you know, like I said early on, you know, it's a superpower if you're willing to be bad, because eventually you find something good. I often tell people, I've never set out to be a great writer. I set out to write great books, and that means I get as many chances to do it as I want.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, 100%. Sebastian, I'm so grateful for you because you've come on to the show, not only to like talk about your life and talk about, your books and, your next novel that's coming out on the 22nd, right? You shared so much valuable information based, on experience with your successful career with the listeners out there, which fulfills the mandate of, this podcast alone, for creators, up and coming authors,
Mhm.
sitting around waiting for better days or waiting for the perfect moment or, you know, worrying about what other people are going to think about me and, all that negativity just all around you. Hopefully this is inspiration for you to be like, okay, let me get up there. Let me just put this down on paper. Let me type out this picture. Let me send it. Or let me just start writing it. Let me self publish. Let me see where it goes. Go
Mhm.
for it. Create,
Yeah,
put the
absolutely.
best
Yeah.
version of yourself out there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm grateful to you, Kino, for creating this space where, you know, your listeners can come and find out, you know, ways of approaching the things that they might want to pursue, from different voices and different sets of experiences. I think that's one of the hardest things, is if you want to be a creative in whatever space, if, if all you ever hear is one kind of, you know, approach, then and that approach doesn't work for you, then you feel like, well, that whole vocation isn't accessible to me. But when you get to hear different people's experiences, different writers, how they approach things, what they went through, you know, that's what it was for me. I remember I read so many books about how to write a novel, and nothing worked for me. I'm, you know, from a young
Yeah,
age, nothing worked. Every time I would read it, I go, I can't do it the way they're doing it. And then years ago, I was in the Vancouver Public Library, and I found a box of cassette tapes. So this was ages ago, but I found this box of cassette tapes from a guy named Ralph McInerney. It was called "Let's Write a Mystery," and I didn't even own a cassette player. I didn't, you know, I had to go find one, you know. But I stuck in these cassettes, and he would talk to you while he was writing his novel. He was saying, you know, now I'm going to write this thing. What are you going to write for this? And I don't know why, but that was the approach that I needed to hear. And when I heard that set of cassette tapes unlocked the process of writing a novel for me. And I wrote my first novel then, and it was terrible, but that was okay, because I learned how to go through the process. And even that novel, which I wrote, I think it was 1997, long before I became a professional novelist. I thought at the time, I thought this was the most amazing experience. Now I've done it. I don't need to do it again. I had the adventure. Um, but
yeah,
then
yeah,
years later, I ended up writing another novel, which became Trader's Blade, and that launched my career. But even now, I can go back to that first book that I wrote, not knowing what I was doing, and I'll still find parts of it where I'm like, oh, I love that scene. I need to get that scene somehow into another book one day. And so, yeah, it's freeing yourself up to try things, to take risks, letting yourself be bad. That's for me, the path to finding something wonderful that you can then build from.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. I mean, I couldn't have asked, for a better conclusion to this conversation. 100%, just take the risk. What's the worst that's going to happen? You get rejected. Okay, you keep moving on. There's not only one publisher, there's not only one editor or one whoever, in the whole entire world. And living in this era, I mean, you and I are doing a podcast, situated in two different continents, you know, then you start looking outside. Okay, if I'm not, gaining any traction with my work within my own country, which is what happened with me, personally speaking, I looked outside and that worked for me, you
Mm-hmm.
know. But if
Yeah.
I thought, okay, no, it's not working for me in South Africa with the work that I'm doing or the music that I'm pushing out, I would have been stuck. I wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
lived a fulfilling, happy life if I never thought, okay, let me try there. Let me reach out there. Let me see what happens. And look, 4 years later, I have the privilege of talking to a phenomenal author.
Well, likewise. Yeah, there used to be stories all the time of artists from North America, from South Africa, from Europe, who were completely unknown in their own countries and famous in Japan. There used to be an old thing
Yeah.
for rock and roll bands. If it's not working, just go to Japan, try to become famous there. Even now, my books are published in 16 different languages. So they're published all around the world in different languages. There are places where I'd love for the books to be big hits. I love going to Italy. I was married in Venice. My books are not remotely popular in Italy at all. They're very popular in the Czech Republic. I don't know why, but that's the nature of it, right? It's such a big world. We all, for the first time in human history, as creatives, we have access to almost the whole world. If your books would be popular in North Korea, that might be a tough one to make happen. But so much the world. So yeah, you're absolutely right. If it's not working in the country you live in, see what happens. Maybe there's another country where your books, your stories, your songs, your art just speaks to the people that live there.
Exactly. That's why, data is so important. Look at what the data is telling you, because especially if you self-publishing, okay, marketing like we so important. But if you're not looking at the data, it's going to affect your marketing.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be audience, I'm going to use you as an example in Italy because I want to blow up in Italy, but the data is saying no, Czech Republic is where, bulk of your audience actually is. I focus now bulk of my time, interact with the audience there. So extremely important. So Sebastian, where can listeners, readers find you online?
Sure. I'm easy to find online. My website is the best place to reach me, which is decastell.com. So that's DECASTELL.com. If you just type in my name in Google, Sebastien de Castell, even if you misspell it, it'll probably find me. As far as my books, you can find them in sort of most bookstores. They're all out in print, in audiobook, in ebook. So I'm pretty easy to find. I am on, Twitter, or X as they call it now, and Facebook and Instagram. I don't spend a lot of time on social media, but I do try to post something, 5 days a week, just a little something so that, people can connect. But if somebody wants to write me, the best way to do that is through my website at decastell.com. And then there's a contact page, and I'm easy to reach. I read every email that I get, and I reply to all of them.
Nice.
Sometimes it takes me a while, but I reply to all of them.
As long as you reply, as long as you get back to them, that's what counts at the end. So we're expecting a big, you must be used, to like a launch day, So we're expecting a big launch party on the 22nd. What's your tradition? What do you do on these days?
It's funny because the launch day is never the big moment. Like there's so many times where the launch day has come and gone and I didn't even notice. Because for me, of course, I'm on to the next book. But there are moments that are always big ones for me, and one of them is coming up, which is when I get a box gets shipped to my house, or a couple of boxes that have the author copies of the book, and that's the first time I'll hold the book in my hand. And for me, that's such an important moment, because that's the first moment when I hold the physical hardback in my hand when I know I finished writing the book. Because until then, you know, technically, if it's not printed yet, you could make another change. What about that? You know, the other day I was listening to the audiobook for Malevolent 8 because they sent me an early copy, and I love the narrator. Joe Jameson's one of the best audiobook narrators in the business. He performs all the parts, which means I get to listen to him have to perform the part of a vampire kangaroo once in a while. And but I was listening to it and I was going, oh, you know, I should change that one line, you know, and of course it's too late for that. But once I hold that physical book in my hand, for me, that's the completion of that journey. This time around, though, I'm actually going to be in Baltimore on the 23rd for Balticon. I'm a guest of honor at Balticon, which is a huge privilege. I'm delighted that they chose me, along with Silvia Moreno Garcia, who the famed writer of Mexican Gothic and other best-selling novels, who, as it turns out, also lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, and she and I are in the same Dungeons and Dragons group.
Okay,
yeah,
that's quite cool.
You meet authors in strange ways sometimes. There's a Dungeons and Dragons group here that's just made up of authors, and so we get together once in a while. I really hadn't played Dungeons and Dragons since I was a teenager, and the funny part is, everybody, when people hear about that, they're like, oh, it must be so exciting and full of storytelling. And I'm like, no, we start at like some tavern and then we end up arguing because we're trying to be true to our characters. We argue for 2 hours before we leave the stupid tavern in the game. So, but yeah, so I'll be at Balticon, and then I'm going to be flying to London to do some events there. I'll be at the Chimera Festival in Scotland. I think I'm doing a couple of Waterstones events. Things like that. So yeah, there's always good times to be had. Yeah.
Oh, Sebastian, keep it up, man. Keep it up. You know, a creator's journey, an author's journey never ends. We never know when it'll end. You know, we'll do until death do us part. So keep doing what you're doing and keep being an inspiration. I mean, you've been an inspiration for me on the show, and definitely going to be an inspiration, you know, for up and coming creators. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kino.
All the best, you know, with the book launch, all the best with the work to come, all the best with your travels. I'm sure London is going to be cool. You know, keep going. Keep going.
Thank you, Kino. Thanks so much.
Okay, so yeah, you never know in this business, and have personal experience with that. You never know when we will interact again. It'll be like, boom, oh, there's Sebastian again. Boom, oh, there's Kino again. You know, but I love to always, you know, keep in contact, you know, and, you know, down the line, you know, hopefully bring you back, you know, for a follow-up interview.
I would love to do that, Kino. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.